the reality is that, Lula has always tended to get on quite well with Republican US presidents. Famously, he got on better with George W. Bush than he did with Obama. And I think probably the scene is set for him getting on better with Trump than with Biden.
Now, when he was re-elected to office in 2022, Brazil's President Lula da Silva was once described by the then US President Barack Obama as the world's most popular politician. He'd replaced the far-right strongman Bolsanaro, promising an array of left-wing policies to return power to the Brazilian people. Well, it's now Lula's third term in office. Since his first term in 2003, he's faced election losses, corruption charges, and a possible 8-year stint in prison, but he was freed after 18 months. In his new book, Lula, the Man, the Myth, and a Dream of Latin America, the former Latin America editor at the Financial Times, Richard Lapper, maps his rise to power and explores his role in the region today. And Richard joins me now. Richard, hello.
Hello, Hugo. Thanks for having me on here.
Thanks very much for being with us. So look, Latin America has been subject to a lot of scrutiny and faced pressure from the Trump administration this past year, very, very notably. Why did you choose to write about Lula now?
Well, in short, because it's such an incredible story, because I was asked. But, I think when you look at these tensions between the Trump administration and Latin America, you would think, wouldn't you, that the relationship between Lula, who has still this image of a rather rumbustious figure, his trade union leadership, his kind of radicalism, and that of Donald Trump, who, of course, is the icon of Lula's nemesis, Jair Bolsanaro. You would think there would be conflicts. And in fact, back in July last year, it looked that there would be, because the US imposed these huge tariffs on Brazil. But what's happened, actually, has been quite surprising. I mean, things have gone very well for Brazil. Brazil's been able, really, to negotiate a very successful conclusion to this little trade spat. And although, it was hit by the tariffs originally, this is even before, last week's revision of those measures by the Trump administration. Although it was hit, the key thing about Brazil these days is that it's much more dependent on China than on the US economically. And so it was quite calmly able to say to Trump, look, you're going to suffer more from these tariff measures.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, let's go back a bit. Lula first came to office in, as I said, in January 2003. Tell us about him as a man and as a leader. What his public persona's like? What people think of him?
I think the thing that's interesting about Lula is his origins as a poor northeasterner. He grew up on a dirt poor farm in the state of Pernambuco. Stricken by drought, abandoned by his father, made this Odysseic journey down to Sao Paulo, a 13-day trip on the back of a lorry, and then grew up in a certain degree of poverty in Sao Paulo, became a trade unionist at a time when Brazil was a metal worker, I should say, a lathe operator, trade unionist eventually, at a time when Brazil was industrializing. And got into politics. And I think it's in this sense, in a very divided and rather exclusive society, Lula kind of represented, his story was emblematic of those of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Brazilians who'd made the same journey. And then when eventually, after four successive attempts at the presidency, he won the election of 2002. He presided over a period, quite an important period of economic inclusion, and a period that cemented, Brazil's consolidating democracy after the military dictatorships of the 60s and the 70s.
And you meant, sorry, go on.
So it's fine.
No, I mean, you mentioned earlier his nemesis, I suppose, Bolsonaro, or perhaps he is Bolsonaro's nemesis. I'm not quite sure which way around we should have it. But was Bolsonaro's election, Bolsonaro being so different, both politically, mainly politically, but kind of in every way, was Bolsonaro's election a reaction to Lula, would you say?
Yes, indeed. I mean, one of the things that happened, the conditions that, in a sense, made Lula, industrialization, began to go into reverse in the 1990s and the 2000s. Brazil deindustrialized. The trade unions had been 30% of the labor force in the 80s. They were less than 10% nowadays, and the gradual diminution of collective action and growing individualism in Brazilian society. And the rise, really, of a group that, in a book I wrote before the current one, it's called Beef, Bible and Bullets, a rise of right-wing conservative lobbies, the huge growth of evangelical Christianity, which tends to be very conservative, a kind of movement from agribusiness against environmental control, which was a big feature of Lula's first 2 terms in government, and a paranoia, really, about insecurity and crime that fed a kind of hardline, iron fist reaction from the right. And all these factors came together in 2018 to bring Bolsonaro to office.
And the fact that Bolsonaro then lost next time around and Lula came back in, and I mean, obviously that election was hugely messy, and we'll talk about the messiness of that election. But with Bolsonaro being such a Trumpish leader in so many ways and in so much of what he did, Lula's pushback against him, successful pushback against him, what do we attribute that to? What lessons can we draw from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that Bolsonaro is quite a polarizing figure, a more ideological figure in a sense than Lula. He's basically divided the right, and so many of his allies who supported his 2018 election victory really jumped ship in 2021, particularly over the COVID controversy when Bolsonaro followed the same kind of denialist strategy that Trump did in the US. And this led to created conditions where Lula, who's always been popular amongst the poorest Brazilians, could just squeak a victory in 2022. The important thing is that Lula is the head of essentially a minority government. So despite all the rhetoric, he hasn't actually been able to change all that much. This is a kind of middle of the road government. This is not, Lula really has eschewed the kind of confrontational strategy that we more typically associate with the Latin American left. People like Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez, these kind of mythical hard left leaders. Lula's a very different sort of figure.
Okay, and look, I mean, so when he won again in 2022, it was a narrow victory, small margin of about 2 million votes, and Bolsonaro basically resisted the handover, shall we say, is now in jail. To what extent should we see Bolsonaro's sort of criminal woes since then? The fact that he's in jail, the fact that he's been prosecuted. How much is that driven by Lula, and how much is that just the Brazilian political system doing what it is supposed to do?
I think this is Brazilian institutions, the judiciary, and all its imperfections, but functioning pretty well, actually. I mean, there's strong evidence that Bolsonaro was conspiratorial in terms of the 2022 coup effort. And I think the weird thing is this could change very quickly. I mean, we're going into an election in October this year, and who's the right-wing candidate? It's Bolsonaro's oldest son, Flavio Bolsonaro, who's a representative in Congress. And, opinion polls suggest that Lula's still marginally ahead, but Flavio Bolsonaro, it's not impossible, I think, that there could be a right-wing victory. I would say the balance of probability favors Lula at this stage. But Brazil's still quite polarized, and these social conservatism is still very powerful. And I don't think, even though Lula's president, his government has been forced to be, relatively cautious.
And how worried will he be? I mean, because obviously he's no friend of Donald Trump's. Not only because of their different political perspectives, but also because of his closeness to China and to some extent Russia as well. How worried will he be about sort of meeting a fate a bit like President Maduro in Venezuela? Will that be on his sort of one of the things that wakes him up in the middle of the night?
Hugo, to be quite honest. I mean, the reality is that Lula has always tended to get on quite well with Republican US presidents. Famously, he got on better with George W. Bush than he did with Obama. And I think probably the scene is set for him getting on better with Trump than with Biden. Yeah. There are many reasons for that. One is that simply that Lula's a tremendously clever negotiator. He's in his element when he's negotiating these reductions in trade tariffs and economic improvements. And the other thing about Lula and about Brazil, from Trump's point of view, is that it is a source of very important resources, which Trump would like to get his hands on, in particular rare earths, which are these very significant metals that are used in warfare these days. And there's potential around deals around that, around oil. Brazil's got so many resources that Trump would like to get access to. And I think that Lula's clever enough to play those cards quite well.
Look, thank you very much indeed. That is Richard Lapper there, the former editor of the Financial Times' Latin American Bureau and Associate Fellow at Chatham House. And his book is Lula, the Man, the Myth, and a Dream of Latin America. And it's available to order at the Times Bookshop, where Times Plus members can get a 20% discount. Just visit timesbookshop.co.uk.